earlier this year from ConservativeHome. As I always say, ConservativeHome's loss is policy exchange's gain, and we're delighted to have Paul overseeing this most original work programme. Original, I say, because it's counterintuitive, and counterintuitive in the days after Donald Trump's victory, where there's been so much concentration inevitably on aspects of red state America, what would here be called red wall voters. And this sort of looks, as it were, in a sort of at a different aspect of the decline of the broad centre-right, particularly decline also of the Conservative Party amongst professional classes as a whole. And we have representatives of those professional classes here, or at least people who've got the sharpest of eye on those professional classes. And it's a hugely significant thing, as I think Charles Moore points out in one of the volumes of his Thatcher book. I think that Thatcher got nearly half of teachers voting for her in 1979, a statistic almost unimaginable nowadays in this era. And the reason for that decline in support for broad centre-right parties, Conservatives in particular, across a number of professions is part of the focus today, is that even when electoral victories can be won, you know, what kind of society are we living in where there is so much of an imbalance broadly within sections of the professional classes? And it's a particular pleasure in that context to be able to welcome back our founding chairman or co-chair, Francis Maude, and I mention it particularly because this year is the 75th anniversary of the publication of his father's brilliant and foundational work, co-authored with Roy Lewis, I think your godfather, if I'm right, of Roy Lewis of the Times, on the English middle class. It's an absolutely brilliant bit of sociology, which I commend to everyone here, had huge impact. And then the subsequent equally brilliant volume, though I'm sorry to inform you, much more expensive to purchase on Amazon, on the professional classes. So we have a brilliant panel for you today to inaugurate this aspect of our work programme. The reasons for this change, it perhaps wasn't really to be fully part of the future of the right, but I think it's because it's, at least in arithmetical terms, the right which is presently imperilled, why it should, as it were, go into this work stream. And without further ado, I'll give you a Paul. Thank you for chairing today, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. So we've got about an hour. We're going to have the panellists speaking for about 5 to 7 minutes each. Then we'll open it up for questions over and out. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time with long introductions, so I'm going to turn to my left and ask Rachel Wolfe, formerly of New Schools Network, co-author of the 2019 highly successful Conservative Manifesto, to speak to us now.
Thank you. So I thought I would talk briefly about 3 things. The first is what I think is the wrong question to ask. The second is what I think is the right question to ask, which Dean has teed up, which is what's happened over the last 50 years. And third, what might we in the right broadly think about doing over the next decade? So first, what's the wrong question to ask? I think that I have been in 100 discussions over the last few years on why young people don't vote Conservative. And the implication has been that there has been something special about what has happened since certainly 2019, possibly before, which has shattered young support. If you look at what has happened, certainly between the period of 2019 and 2024, actually the vote share has declined fairly equally across age groups and fairly equally across class groups, because everyone hated us and all for the same reasons. So I think when you're trying to think about the recent loss and how you rebuild from that, the question of young professionals is the wrong question. It was core public services, the economy and delivery that shattered us across the board. What is unquestionably true, though, is what Dean said, which is if you went back to the 1970s, a much more significant percentage of professionals, including in the public sector professions, would have voted Conservative than today. And if you looked at, say, 2010, not teachers so much, but you'd still have seen far more doctors professing support for the Conservative Party than you do today. And why might that be true? And that's, I think, what Paul's going to be investigating over the next few months. But it strikes me there are some factors that might be driving that. The first is that I think affects professionals more generally. The 1970s was a period when we were emerging from a period of absolute social mobility as opposed to relative social mobility. So we've seen a huge expansion in the size of the middle class, and that continued for some period. A large proportion of people therefore saw a absolute rise in their own chances, income, professional status, without a concomitant loss in anybody else's. We're now not in that period. We're in a period of basically sorting mechanisms of relative social mobility as well as overall declining social mobility. So the precariousness of your existence as a professional and your child's plausible future is much greater today than it would have been credibly in the 1970s. So I think that's one. The second is that if I think about the basic dividing line of the 1970s, it was against the unionised workers and nationalisation and certain assumptions about how you run the economy, in which the public sector professions, certainly teachers and doctors, might well have been on the Conservative side of that debate. They too didn't like their children doing homework by candlelight. They were also frustrated by the battles and the way in which tax was redistributed to certain sectors and people. That is not the core dividing line that has existed in the last 15 years, which has been much more about the overarching size of the state and expenditure in tax, at least articulated, not necessarily delivered, in which teachers and doctors are on the opposite side of what the Conservative Party espoused. Again, didn't deliver, and I definitely think that our habit of talking in extremely tough terms and delivering the opposite was not helpful in explain to people what we did. So I think that's another big difference. A third big difference is that if you'd looked at those professions in the 70s, they would have been much more male. And all of these professions have become much more female. And we know that there are big gender gaps that drive politics. We actually probably have less of a gender gap in our politics than we're going to get in the next 5 years, because we haven't seen quite the explosion of young, non-educated men going to populist right parties that you've seen in the rest of Europe and America. So that's coming, but we still have a major gender gap. And then I think the fourth is that through Thatcher, then Blair, and then Cameron, the model of how we ran the public sector became much more about accountability and judging people for their performance, which I absolutely support, but that unquestionably resulted in much more opposition from some parts of the professional sector. So I think there are these big trends, some of which you can think about how you might change, some of which you might not wish to change, and some of which I have no idea how you change, which might have led to some of those gaps. What does that tell you usefully, if anything, about what you might do next? And I'm not sure it tells you that much usefully, if anything, so apologies for that preamble. So let me move to a sort of slightly different point, which is what did I learn when I was setting up the New Schools Network, which for those who don't know was the organisation that helps teachers and charities and others across the country set up schools, and in my interaction with the school reform projects of the 2010s with Michael Gove. And I think what I discovered is something that probably won't surprise any of you, but it's still important to remember, which is it is still the case that teachers across this country want order, tough behaviour, and what Francis before called small c conservatism. Indeed, it is their resistance to change that in part drove their opposition to Gove's reforms. It is definitely still the case that there are large numbers of professionals, certainly in education and medicine, who are deeply frustrated by the combination of rigidity, incompetence and waste that bedevil their lives. This is really extreme now, I think, in medicine. And there are significant numbers of professionals who get excited by, and you've seen this grow in education in the last decade, the idea of doing something different that gives them a degree of responsibility and autonomy. So it's not that you cannot create a set of policies and programs that are of the right that excite those professionals, and I think we should probably be thinking about those more than how we immediately pull them back to voting Conservative. But I also think that for as long as the core dividing line is going to be expenditure on the state and therefore pay, it is going to be a while before they come back to vote for us in large numbers.
Rachel, thank you very much. And now over to Edward, former Minister at Justice under Boris Johnson.
No, Boris Johnson, no, David Cameron.
David Cameron. And currently the chairman of IPSO. So, everybody.
Thank you. I want to go back to the 1960s, where political scientists said that you tended to vote according to your class. I don't think that's any longer the case. There are a lot of statistics about 2024 election, but a couple of them are quite interesting, it seems to me. They thought that 42% of those with a university degree voted Labour and 18% voted Conservative. Of those earning 70,000 a year or more, 40% voted Labour and 22% Conservative. And those figures are much the same when the annual income is between £50,000 and £70,000. So the divide doesn't appear to be class-based, except the right can no longer expect the support of the graduate class. Since that is now 50%, as opposed to the 60s when it was something like 8%, that is pretty significant. So let me turn to what lawyers think. They used to support the right on the whole. I was a member of a fairly typical set of chambers in the 70s, 80s and 90s. I would think probably 80% voted Conservative. In the chambers I now belong to, more than 100 people, I should think you'd be struggling to get half a dozen people who voted Conservative, or at least would admit to voting Conservative. Why did all this change? Bob Marshall-Andrews, in his rather splendid book about being off message, describes a seminal moment 4 weeks before the 1997 general election. A Labour fundraising dinner was held at the River Cafe, organised by Helena Kennedy and Charlie Faulkner. At £550 a plate, it was not for everyone. However, it was attended by 250 lawyers, of whom Bob said, many of whom had not previously been conspicuous in the vanguard of leftish politics. So where had they been hiding? I'm not quite sure. It suddenly was the case from 1997 that all sorts of shy Labour lawyers became Tony Blair fans. They liked the Human Rights Act. They liked the elevation of the law to being very important, and particularly lawyers being important. Of course, judges have changed. When I started, they tended to be small c conservative, post-war, very kind of almost reactionary in their approach. Now the very qualities that would have helped you up the greasy judicial pole will now have you sliding down it. I'm afraid the Conservative in lawyers' eyes party is associated with Brexit, illiberal immigration policies, and a toxic combination of incompetence and mild corruption. So, what could alter the loyalties of lawyers? I think exposure to this government is certainly going to help. Immigration is probably one of the two big issues. But if you asked Mr. or Ms. Average Lawyer what they thought about the subject, they would tell you they were very uncomfortable with the last government's policies. If you asked them, however, did they want to control immigration, they would agree, but they would want a compassionate policy and would be quite unable to identify quite what that would be. And lawyers are very protective of the rule of law, which is interpreted as adherence to international obligations, however vague and however out of date, and in the event of clash, a preference for the courts rather than the acts of the executive, or, if possible, even legislation. So a failed immigration policy by this government, and it will fail, will not make much difference to the professional vote. The economy, I think, is more fertile ground. A combination of high taxes and economic failure will start the professionals doubting the wisdom of their vote, or at least feeling they've given the Labour Party a chance and the Labour Party have squandered the opportunity. So eyes will turn to the Tories, and I don't think reform will have much traction with this particular constituency. They'll have to present themselves as a party which is no longer embarrassing to support. The Truss legacy is hard to shift, but the electorate is very volatile. I'm sure professionals are quite that volatile, but clear, consistent policies and no change in leadership will help. A lot depends on Kemi Badenoch. And I think the essential tension will lie between tacking to the centre and picking up the graduate professional vote and giving potential reform voters a reason to vote Conservative. And I don't think we should ultimately be trimming much. A party need not be too concerned with what is fashionable. Margaret Thatcher was certainly not. I think the future should be based on sound and consistent policy making and should reflect values that cut across class and occupation and are rooted in common sense. And if that's populist, so be it. The key will be strong policies couched in moderate language that cut across divisions.
And would thank you very much. So education, law, and now over to health and the NHS. Luke, I think this is your PX debut, if I'm correct. Welcome, Luke Evans, currently very sensibly placed in Kenny Badenoch's health team, and the health service. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Paul gave me the brief to say speak as a doctor for the Conservatives, and it reminds me to when I was a medical student and there was an anagram put out for us. Those who spelt spine became doctors. Those who spelt something else became urologists or politicians. So I always knew where my bread's been buttered. But I thought to try and break this down and make it more practical from the doctor's perspective is to talk about hands, head and heart. And what do I mean by that? Well, from the hands is the day-to-day stuff of working in the health service. You have to appreciate the speed of change that you've seen in the health service, just even in the technology. Many of you will be on blood pressure medication, something like Ramipril. Now, when that was first started out, you'd have to go into hospital for 3 or 4 days to get monitored for it. Now, every GP you'll go and see it are probably giving it out in a consultation 3 or 4 times a day. If you had your gallbladder out, it would be open surgery and you'd be in hospital for a week. Within the space of a few years, that's done laparoscopically and you can go out on the same day. So that churn is very quick, and there's always a great stat from medicine that 50% of what you learnt in medical school is obsolete by the end of the time you get out of medical school. So that pace is moving very, very fast. But on top of that, to try and manage it, we take away the autonomy. The system has managed to put layer upon layer upon layer. And it means well. For example, one of the problems is if you have an operation, you're at risk of having a blood clot. So we say, well, let's make sure we put stockings and give people an injection to make sure that they don't get that blood clot. Well, how are we going to record that? Well, let's do a list. So we put a checklist in. But the problem goes is, well, we need to make sure they don't have bed sores, so we'll checklist on that. And we need to make sure they don't have an allergy, so we'll checklist on that. And we need to make sure they're seen every 4 hours, so we'll do a checklist on that. We need to do their observation, so we'll do a checklist on that. We need to make sure that we've notified the carers to make sure they're looked after. And the list goes on and on and on. And that becomes very burdensome, very laborious, and very demotivating because you're filling in through protocols. On top of that, there's the feeling of not being valued. One of the biggest things you speak to in the health service is doctors and nurses particularly feel they're being undervalued. And this isn't necessarily something that's naturally pernicious. It's more a fact that the skill set of other professions is coming up through the ranks. And what I mean by that is, when I started, I would be asked to do venflons, put in cannulas. As a house officer, that was my job. By the time I became a mid-level junior doctor, that was being done by the nurses. And now we have physician assistants coming in, healthcare assistants being able to do more jobs. This is great for upskilling the doctors, but the downside is it devalues some of their roles that they have. That leads us on to the head part, and this is the understanding. One of the biggest problems we see with the farmers at the moment is not what's going on, is that you don't understand farming. Well, there's a definite belief that we don't understand, the Conservatives don't understand healthcare. And that's because of all the changes that get in place. You think of Lansley's changes that have gone in place, you think of the associate physicians that are being brought in place, but even Labour struggle with this with something called MTAS, modernising medical careers, or the tech basis that they tried to bring in. If we're not seen to understand the profession, then why are people going to trust us? And my father's GP, when I put this question to him saying, why don't you vote Conservative? He said, well, that's difficult because the final thing is the heart. He simply said, I'm not sure the Conservatives believe in the NHS. And that's the final bit that we need to solve, is how do we create the belief that we really care about it? And particularly for doctors, one of the biggest things they're caught up between is they understand personally the Conservatives may improve their lot, but professionally and principally, it's a socialist NHS, and how do we support that principle? And I hope we get time to maybe discuss some of the solutions towards doing that. But I think it all comes from understanding, using the right language, and being practical and explaining why you're doing in the way in which the profession gets it will bring us back and bring back some of that trust that you talked about.
Luke, thank you very much. That's very good. I'll make a point of asking you about some of the solutions later. But before I do that, over to Francis Maude, who knows and remembers more about the Conservative Party, but also because of his role under the coalition in how public services and the civil service work that I'm ever likely to forget. So Francis, welcome, over to you.
Thanks very much. Well, look, I mean, I think it's great to do this, embark on this project, and thank you, Dean, for thinking of it and linking it in a way that's sentimentally appealing to me to the 75th anniversary of my father's book, which became a minor classic, a classic in the world of sociology. It was published in 1949, a year after the NHS was formed, 5 years after the Butler Education Act, both of which had a significant effect on the relevant professions. And I think it's worth asking the questions, and hopefully there will be some answers. They won't be straightforward, about why it is that over this long period where there was kind of an assumption, even in the 1970s when Edward and I both started as barristers, there was kind of an assumption that barristers would be conservative, and they probably mostly were, with the notable exception of Bob Marshall Andrews, in whose chambers I did one of my pupilages. He was a firebrand even then, and a very amusing one. But there was an assumption that you'd be conservative, and that is eroded. And I have fixed in my mind that in 1979, 75% roughly of primary school teachers voted Conservative, and that's kind of inconceivable today. So what's gone on? Is it something that, for me, the Conservative Party, I'm tribal, can do to reverse that and rebuild their support? So a few reflections, really, quite broad. Back in 1949, society was much more stratified. There was a clear status, a high status attached to belonging to professions. And we now attach the word profession to loads of things that aren't actually professions. In the civil service, they have a list of numerous numbers of professions, a lot of which simply aren't professions in the way that would be ordinarily understood. And it was a time when social classes were much more clearly delineated, and there were clear social markers, accent, education, what your parents did, and so on. And this is much less clear now. And it looked like that back in the 1940s, really through to the 1970s, more or less. Small c Conservative looked like it served the interest of people who belonged to the professions. And it looked like the left looked like they wanted more mobility, they were going to be more disruptive, and the Conservative Party was much more small c Conservative than it subsequently became, particularly under Thatcher. Interestingly, I think that's slightly reversed. What you see going on with the current government's policy towards education in particular seems to be intended to reverse the move towards social mobility, the putting halt on new free schools, funding for free schools, in case they disrupt the viability of failing schools in the LEA sector. So that coupled with the death of deference and a much more educated population at large and access to information, particularly through the internet, all of these have eroded the sense of unaccountable almost status that professional people felt they had. So if you're in a profession, if you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, your patient or your client will come to talk to you already knowing much more than they would have done a couple of decades ago. They will have researched very likely to research their condition. And so professionals now have to explain much more. Daylight has been let in on magic, and we know that's an uncomfortable thing. Much more accountability, as was discussed. Rachel talked about that. And accountability which comes through transparency is very welcome. Accountability that comes through loading on more and more management overload in the way that Luke describes with these wretched checklists, much less appealing. there are probably greater divides in income in the professions, from the highest, who will tend to be, lawyers in the private sector. Compare what doctors, consultants earn with in their private practice with what they earn as NHS doctors. It's a huge divide, and nothing more it illustrates that more vividly than the junior doctors' pay strike. So the questions which occurred to me, a couple of colleagues on the panel have talked about autonomy. And there was the sense that professionals ran their own lives, the professional organisations, the Law Society, the Bar Council, the GMs, well, what was the BMA really was the regulator of, and all of that's been pushed to one side by state regulators. So there's much less personal autonomy for the professional person, much less autonomy for the professions as a whole. And I suspect that's both devaluing and demoralising. I was just reflecting on something we did in the coalition government. We ran a programme called the Public Service Mutuals Programme, where we encouraged groups of, it built on something that Labour had a bit ineffectually started in the latter years of Blair. We encouraged and supported groups of public sector workers to spin out into an employee-owned entity which continued to deliver the public service but under a contract rather than as part of a bureaucracy, an in-house function. The largest number of those were in the health and social care sectors. All of those chose to be a not-for-profit, to be a social enterprise, not a commercial exercise. I used to visit these, would always ask people, would you go back and work for the NHS, the council, the government, whatever they'd come out of. Never heard a single person say anything other than an emphatic no. When I asked why, the answer was always some version of, because now we can do things. And in the healthcare sector, people would say, a nurse would say, I can see how we can do this better. Don't have to ask anyone, don't have to put in a business plan to some committee, which is like dropping a stone down a very deep well, you never hear the splash. And so they weren't earning any more money. They would say, we're working much harder than we ever were, but we feel much more rewarded because we can see the benefit of what we do. We take responsibility when things don't go so well. We get the credit when things do go well. And that lack of autonomy currently is, I think, a big feature. And the disruption that comes from reorganisation. I think we shouldn't underplay this. Why does every government come along and try to reorganise the NHS? Why? Because it doesn't work very well. Do we see similar reorganisations in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Europe, our European neighbours who have much more hybrid systems than we do, much less socialised, much less state-run than ours is? Far cry from what happens in America, but still much more, far different from what we have, much more stable as well. And I was just to finally, I found it buried deep in, there's a chapter in this magnificent tome, which I appreciate not everyone will have read, and in the chapter on the professions. And it's this, the multiplication of educational administrators has been accelerated since the Butler Act came into force and local educational authorities started planning like men possessed. Much good work has been done, but at considerable cost. For chief officers tend greatly to multiply their staffs so that action and correspondence tend to become subject to the worst kind of bureaucratic delays. The administrative structure of the National Health Service, they go on, is not yet so complex. But that was only a year old, so we can see what's happened since then. So it feels to me there are social changes which have happened over this period, which are irreversible and which are mostly good. But there are ways in which the autonomy, the status of professional people has been gradually eroded over that time, which is capable of being changed. And I hope as we embark on this project with, I hope, lots of help from all of you and many others, we will hope to find some answers. Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 25 minutes, and I hope I'm not going to rile anyone just by using chairman's privilege to ask Luke. I promised I'd ask you about solutions because you didn't have time.
Yep.
But Francis was able to get at what he thought some might be.
Yep.
What are your thoughts?
I think first of all is number one, clearly demonstrate your understanding. This is, if we take the pharmacists as the current example, is a really good one. The farmers say you don't understand what you're doing to the farming industry. And if I look at what's going on with the NICS introduction in the NHS, the same thing can be applied there. GPs, for example, care homes and hospices have gone, great, we're getting 22.6 billion going to the NHS. But mentally, they've gone, hang on a second, we've now got to pay the NICS. Where are we going to find the 70 grand for an average GP surgery? And you can really see them stumble because they've gone, hang on, Labour was supposed to sort this out. We've got the money, but they don't understand what they're doing here. And either the health team went along with the Treasury's decision and planned it and didn't, knew this was going to happen, or missed it and it's a mistake and they're going to have to sort it out. That erodes people's trust in what's going on. But the simple things, I've often argued, if I asked any of you now to book a round the world tour, go to 10 different countries, book the hotels and the flights, you'd do it this afternoon. And then I say cancel it tomorrow and you'll be able to do it all in one go. The NHS is not even close to that. Many of you will know, I've had neck surgery recently. The number of appointments that come through, I had to make a formal complaint to cancel one of my physio sessions because the Hospital Act didn't allow me to do so. If you can get, for the working people, things like tech that is as good as your phone, that shows an understanding, but it's a creativity the Conservatives can do because we understand that, and we're unleashing people to do what they do best, which is look after people. So it's the simple solutions that are put forward that you can actually embed straight away. And there's many of those you could get. I could go on and on, but reviewing prescribing. If you wanted to set up a GP surgery, there's no central place to say, how do I do this? Booking an appointment is the number one problem that people have. And every GP practice that I've ever worked at has the same problem. Yet if you go, well, who does it best? There's no central way of finding that out. That to me is crazy. And these simple solutions that empower people to be able to make those judgments can go a long way to making a difference.
Right, thanks very much. I'm going to take two at a time. Questions, please, not statements. And if you could give your name and where you come from when you ask, that would be very helpful. So I take the lady there and the lady behind her too. So, yep.
Thank you. I'm Virginia Crosby. Until recently, I was the Conservative Member of Parliament for Anglesey, and I'm on the General Election 24 Review Committee. So I've just come from CCHQ here because I thought actually you might give me some great ideas. But my question really relates to one that Luke mentioned, which is the language that we use. And I'll give you an example. We've got Rishi has got 2 million followers on LinkedIn. And Keir Starmer has got less than 500,000, and the Chancellor has only got 100,000. Now, I know, Luke, you're fantastic on TikTok, as is Nigel Farage. But really, in terms of, are we using the right language to reach out to these professionals? We really could do so much more on the likes of LinkedIn.
Okay, and yeah.
Thank you. I'm Joanne Nadler, a freelance journalist. I'd like to zoom out a little bit and take a slightly more macro approach, if that's okay, and ask the panel what they feel about the fact that, as it seems to me, we've seen over the last 30 years essentially a project, first started by Blair and Brown, essentially to sort of embed socialism in all the institutions, which means there is essentially a vested interest for the professionals to be on the left. That's particularly so in education, but pretty much across all the other, what I think we would all in this room refer to as the professions. It's a twofold problem. It's cultural through the Equality Act, and it's through the kind of extension of the client state through Brownite economics, which was only furthered, I think, by George Osborne.
All right, so we've got language and we've got the advance of socialism under Blair and Brown in the professions. Did it really start then? Is that correct? Discuss. Who wants to start?
Very quickly, so let me do the regulator first. The idea of socialism. But I totally agree with you. One of the things as an MP is when we've had problems. So I was in the energy department. When you have a problem, your constituent comes to you saying my energy prices are high. Yeah, we go, well, we've got off-gem for your power, we've got off-watt for your water, we've got off-com if there's something else with your mobile phone. We've outsourced all the decision making. So when as an MP you try and pull a lever, or you're a minister, you try and pull a lever, everything takes forever to get sorted out, and the public wants something doing that now. Even more as an MP, if I've got a problem with my police, you'd have to go to the Police and Crime Commission. You don't go down locally. The school is very difficult. The NHS is the same. I remember doing my... we've got a CDC being built in my patch, and the first time I had a meeting with them to say who's in charge, 6 people came up on the screen. And I said, well, who's in charge when there's a problem? Who's going right? They said, well, we all are. I mean, that is nonsense in that sense, and that's back to the accountability. So I do think it has been skewed, and Liz Truss struggled to get rid of this when she did her budget, because she said, let's try and bypass the OBR, but didn't do it in the right way, which made it very difficult. Virginia, I think you're spot on about the language, and that goes for whether we're speaking out to the public, but to the professions, it's this understanding of using the right language. And even if you don't agree with them, explaining why you're doing what you're doing is the biggest thing that's lost. And Labour are learning this the hard way with the NICs and the GPs, because they're now having extra general meetings and things like that about whether they're going to strike. You've got the pharmacists saying they're going to go on strike now, which is the first time ever. Labour haven't picked this up either, so I think it's there for the picking if the Conservatives want to get it right. But actually, you've got to do the hard work to speak to them. And if you don't like what we're doing, or vice versa, you've got to explain it very well so at least they can understand the other side. But that comes down to your point about trust. At the moment, they don't trust the Conservative Party.
Rachel.
Can I be slightly disagreeable on the panel?
Excellent.
So I am a bit sceptical about both the language point and the questions. So I'm going to wrap them together for a couple of reasons. First is, I am personally not convinced that you would get to a situation where the farmers say, well, they really get us, so I don't mind that my inheritance tax is going up. And similarly, I'm not convinced you get to a situation where the GPs are like, well, I get that they knew they were doing this and they had reasons to do it, so I don't mind that I need to find 70k for next. In the sense that tax decisions are hard, and there is no kind of easy scenario where you tax people and they're happy about it. And we have to recognise that there are hard choices about whether you tax and spend or don't, which leads me to a second point, which I think is really critical, which is I think that we mustn't abdicate responsibility for the decisions we made as well as the way in which we communicated them. We created a lot of these regulators, not the Blair-Brown government. We inherited a health system that was vastly more market and choice based than it is today. We decided to make it much more sclerotic, much more bureaucratic, much more centrally managed than the foundation hospital system that we inherited under Blair. We made the decision to subsidise people's energy bills in the wake of the energy crisis. And this is not a question of language, it's a question of policy decisions and the actual state of the public realm and the economy, some for very understandable reasons, some for less so, that existed in 2024. So I think we absolutely have to get to language. So I don't want to diminish the idea that communication matters or the mechanism of communication matters. But we are way before that stage, which is, why did it go wrong? What do we think we would do differently? And what would be the result of it?
The embedding of regulation, I think, is absolutely right. I mean, Angus talked about the Bar Council. In fact, we have 3 regulators in the Bar now. We have the Bar Council, the Bar Standards Board, and the Legal Services Board, who superimposed above that. It was actually set up by the 2007 Legal Services Act, which is under the Labour government. It's an example of a huge amount of regulation. And the legal profession is basically cowed by this regulation. They just behave themselves in the way that they think they ought to. They don't push back or kick back in any way, and they've got to start doing that, so that they are bombarded with ridiculous directions and standards that are kind of not sensible. They're very politically correct. And there's a lot of subcontracting. Judges decided it was a good idea to have the guidance written on how to approach same-sex by Stonewall. There is generally a widespread abdication of responsibility by the professions for themselves, and a slight feeling of nervousness about, well, perhaps we ought to go with the times. There's got to be a movement against that.
Just quickly, I mean, I think your point, Jaron's point about has everything been going in a socialist direction? Well, the answer is no. If you look at but there's a big difference between, for example, the health world and the educational world. In schools, what Blair did was to increase autonomy, or allow the possibility for increased autonomy for individual schools. Free schools, Michael Gove said what he said was, we're just building on that and expanding it a bit. Actually, it was very radical and took it in a very unsocialist direction. And that's now being vigorously stopped by Bridget Phillipson. But in the health world, I think what we did the exact reverse, and this brings together the point about language and substance. We claimed we were doing something very radical with health, but in fact we were making it much more sclerotic, because we allowed the NHS establishment to overlay the Lansley reforms with so many organised bureaucratic organisations. The whole thing became much worse. So, you know, I think there's no common pattern here, nor, I suspect, is there much difference in the loss of support between those two different professions. But all I can tell you is, you know, when you empower, when you liberate professional people from constraints, as happened with our mutuals, the most successful of these mutuals, or the one with the best anecdotes, I suppose, is what I really mean, is a little GP practice in Leicester, and they were full of enthusiasm for what they were doing, had great stories. And I said to them, well, this is such a great story, will you come and tell this story at the Conservative Party conference? And these were all, to a person, they were NHS lifers, and I'm confident none of them had ever voted Conservative in their life. And I was expecting them, no, we couldn't do that. And they came, and they told the story to the whole conference, and it was great. And they were so proud of what they were doing, what they'd achieved, which was indeed remarkable, but they wanted everyone to know about it. They didn't have that political constraint. So I do think there's something in this. Empower people, liberate them, give them the sense of ownership, and it's not kind of financial or economic ownership in the way a business would understand, but it's psychological and emotional ownership of what you do. You join a profession because you've got a calling. It's a vocation, and you want to do it, and you want to do it well, and you want to have charge of what you do and be responsible. Not everyone wants to be responsible, but it is part of the deal for what you do. And I think a big part of this is about re-empowering, liberating people, and it will take time. It's not a quick thing, but that seems to me to be potentially, but we shall need to research this very carefully.
Thank you. Next to, I can see Andrew, and David, yes, right at the back. Yeah.
Well, I know we're coming up to the pantomime season, and therefore you're going to forgive me if, when we were doing a rehearsal the other day, Gary Wilmot does all of the underground stations in London in one go, and he does it to Modern Major General. We tried to do it to all of the arts and culture secretaries that I have known since I started work in 1968. And we Wagnerianly ran out halfway through. And so making a serious point, if we're going to be talking about engaging with professionals, we need ministers who are going to engage with those professionals. Now, you made the point about farmers, a very good point. Now, I actually do farm 4,500 acres. I'm very proud of it. It's kind of very, very much something I've for 40 years wanted to do and make it environmentally friendly and everything. But I have never been able to engage with anybody in the Conservative Party about this. I have never been able to engage with an arts minister at all. I mean, during COVID, when we were battling for theatre on every single level, nobody really engaged. Nobody, not in the commercial theatre sector. So if we're talking about the commercial theatre sector, I'm talking about what the world is outside. The other thing I would say is that I think that you're underestimating one thing. Everybody's saying it's a wonderful world that we're now in, that we can engage with other people. Well, we're engaging a world where we know that there are hostile governments out there We know that there are hostile algorithms that are now making sure that anything that's negative is the thing that's posted. And so we are actually in a different world. Professionals, I know, are scared. They are frightened about what they say. They worry whether they can actually talk. They don't feel they can engage. So I think that the Conservative Party, and I'm a little bit sad to hear trotted out really what the Conservative Party might have done or what it might do. If the Conservative Party is going to have a future, it's got to engage with these issues, and it's got to engage with professionals properly who know what they're doing, provide ministers who, when they get there, are going to stay in their post.
Absolutely right.
David Landau, till recently an academic clinician in the NHS and now working partly here at Policy Exchange, and very much poor B-side to what we've just heard. The discussion of substance versus communication. Communication is always important and substance is always important. I don't think there's a question of which one should come first. And if we're looking for solutions, first of all, you cannot communicate something without substance because by definition you will be talking rubbish. So there are a couple of big things. One that have been in my head. One is across the board. I stood at the last election for the Conservative Party, and when I had a short period of grace when I was a preferred candidate, I gave a husting in CCHQ about why you had to vote Tory if you love the NHS. And the main reason, main reasons were two. One is that they're not in hoc with the unions, and the other one is that they're going to have substantial growth in the economy. And I think one of the key things we need is, are we looking after our hospitals? Are we looking after the infrastructure? Are we looking after schools, prisons, train stations? If that is something that we can achieve because we know how to run the economy better, then that is a really substantial thing that I think would help turn professionals towards Conservatives, because we are making genuine promises in a way that we clearly understand. The other one is the unions, and in the NHS, it's the BMA, and I do think communications could focus on a bit of a demonisation of the BMA, which should not be too difficult, in my opinion.
Right, who wants to come in on either of those? Actually, particularly on this very interesting point, which has seized my imagination more widely in the future of the right, about the amazing turnover of ministers in the last 10 years or so. So, Francis.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Andrew on this. And one of the benefits of the coalition was that reshuffles were much harder to do because you had to use four-dimensional chess rather than three. And so a number of us stayed in post for the whole time. And I could not have made the progress I made in saving money, cutting costs from the overhead of government and reforming the civil service without staying there till I knew more than the people who were working for me. And indeed, I mean, I appreciate not everyone also will have read my review of civil service governance and accountability, but I have a chapter specifically on this, about ministers being selected with much more of an eye to their knowledge, to the fit, it being the right fit with their experience and background and knowledge, but also the need for them to stay in post for a proper period of time. So, and I think if you get ministers who stay there for long, they do engage. They of course they ought to engage, and in a consistent and intelligent way. With the people in the occupations and professions with whom their portfolio covers. But they're much more likely to do that and build the relationships if they're there for a proper period of time. So I think 100% right. Rachel.
I agree with that, and I think it is, why did the school reforms work? Partly because the same ministers were in place for a few years at a time, also partly because they had a number of years in opposition to think about it and to talk to the outside world. It's actually often easier to talk to the outside world when you're in opposition than when you're in government, and it's a critical period where you try and figure out what's going on. I think the other challenge of the last few years, as well as the incredible rotation of ministers, has been the incredible rotation of philosophies under which those ministers operated. We've had every conceivable flavour of conservatism through a sequence of prime ministers, and that makes it very hard to talk to your group, because what on earth are you talking to them about? Are you libertarians or not? So I think there is helpfulness in a degree of consistency. However, I also think, which goes back to what Francis and Luke and others have talked about, that if you're able to create public services that have a degree of autonomy and stability, these rotations of ministers matter somewhat less. I don't think in Germany they care very much.
Absolutely right.
And we have to think about what kind of self-perpetuating responsible structures we're trying to create that allow, yes, politicians to be fundamentally accountable to the electorate for what's going on, but also that professionals can get on with things. And that has been very, very difficult.
Yeah. Absolutely right.
Yeah, but I agree, of course, about ministers. But of course, we have to get into power before we have that problem. And somehow we've got to persuade professionals that to vote Tory is acceptable, that we want professionals to be able to do their job, to free them from all the bureaucracy and the restraints of regulation. And if we can somehow get that message across, people might vote for us, and then we will be able to have the problem of shuffling or not reshuffling.
Oh, just very quickly on that. I mean, you've got to be the leadership you want. I think that's the biggest thing. And one of the biggest frustrations in the Conservative Party that I get now asked when I go out and people see me and speak to me, say, which kind of Conservative are you? I'm like, well, one kind of Conservative. You know, the 5 families, all the different bits and pieces. There's not many of us left. We collectively, if we can trust each other, we can build a consensus. If we can build a consensus, we can build an idea of where we want to go. If we can build an idea, we can ask the public, do you like that idea and where we need to go? That's what we've got to spend our time. I'm really pleased Kemi hasn't come out and given policy decisions, and long may she not do for the next couple of few months, to learn what we need to say, reorganise how we're going to do it, because at the end of the day, responsibility is really key. We've got to do that ourselves as MPs. We know that. We've got to show it. Then the professionals will see we've got someone we can trust, believe, and they're going to deliver on what they do.
2 last ones, I'm afraid. Go there, and the lady right at the end there, yeah. So.
Joanna Bogle. Is there room for a Conservative, perhaps Policy Exchange could do it, group that would teach history more accurately? A lot of boys and girls don't know the truth about history. For example, that there were schools before 1870. They don't know. They think it was only state schools. I've been told by young people who should know better that Oxford and Cambridge were started in the late 19th century. A lot of people don't know there were any doctors and nurses before the National Health Service, no Edith Cavell, etc. Seriously, is there room for a truth about social history in Britain discussion? I really mean this. If you look at the schools in the 19th century, there were some really awfully good ones, and the standards were astonishingly high, including the teacher training colleges, where in an ordinary state school system that was going to emerge, inherited teachers who were expected to be fluent in Latin or Greek or a university or a European language. I just think, could the Conservatives, small c, sponsor something on the truth about the social history in Britain? Otherwise, don't be surprised when young people think Conservatives are wicked people who inherited a socialist thing.
Right, and then here.
Matthew Trimming. I chair a couple of software companies, but I'm just here in a private capacity. I just wanted to ask a question about consistency of philosophical message, which I think is one of the things that Kemi won on, and her pamphlet on sort of the bureaucratization of not quite the middle classes, as she put it, but certainly some of the themes that we've touched on is an interesting sort of preamble to a longer piece, I think. I wanted to ask, though, a question about the balance between thinking about professions and thinking about people as individuals and members of families. Because if we look at the US election, there are many reasons that the Democrats lost, but one of them was to think about people in identitarian blocks, and just to assume, because you are a certain type of person, maybe colour, maybe gender, maybe profession, that you would vote in a particular way, and it was just simply about triangulation. And actually what they lost to was someone who just saw people as individuals. So what is the balance in this piece of work between thinking about professions, quite rightly, but thinking about, you know, human beings within those professions, many of whom are part of families as well?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I think that was what I was trying to say, that we should be cutting across these divisions and not trying to say, well, we must do this to appeal to professions, or we must do that to appeal to someone else. I think if the core values are sufficiently core, then they should be able to transcend these distinctions. And I think that's absolutely right. As for the education, I wonder if Angela Rayner, who has been extremely rude about Etonians, is familiar with the fact that Henry VI set it up and the circumstances in which he set up the school. No, I think there's widespread ignorance, and I absolutely agree.
Who wants to?
No, I think I was just recalling that my father's second book, which was on professional, is called Professional People, not the professions. And it's a really important point, because actually part of what feels to me is a key part of this is that you can't just the essence of being a professional person, belonging to having that vocation, which you've kind of gone through a long process of getting qualified to practice, is that autonomy and that responsibility that you have to use what your combination of your native wit and the knowledge you've accumulated and the experience you accumulate to do things, often for doctors in kind of literally life and death circumstances, and then take responsibility for it. And I can't remember who it was who said, who's responsible for something. And of course, when 6 people say they're responsible for something, no one is. That's kind of rule 1 of life. So I think focus on people is absolutely crucial.
Can I pick that point up? Because for me, this is what it all comes down to. The biggest thing in the pandemic we saw was, what's the government going to do about it? What's the NHS going to do about it? What's the schools going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? We Conservatives actually need to talk about personal responsibility, and that goes all the way through in both the way we talk about things, but the way we set our professions up. One of the biggest frustrations you speak to of any doctor who is looked after by the GMC and the reviews that they have done is that we all know doctors that get through the reviews because no one's going to take responsibility for signing them off because of what it means. So therefore you get the bad doctors going through the system, and all the good doctors get put it through anyway. So it feels kind of pointless. And you're absolutely right. If you divide everyone up, you divide everyone up until they're individuals. So there you have to have a collective before it. And talking about your personal responsibility in terms of how you look after your house, how you look after your health, how you look after your family, but that can be seen through the professional eyes as well. So I think that's the golden thread that runs through all this, because at the moment we're seeing the Labour Party move it further and further to say, we'll take that responsibility for you in those decisions. And we've seen that with the Tony Blair move, and part of us, yes, with all these regulators. If we can get back to that individual idea of responsibility, reward and risk, I think that's actually a message you can sell to the public. Part of what Donald Trump did, not all of it, but was about that, saying look after yourself and we'll support you in doing that. I think that's quite a powerful message that a lot of people want at this time.
Luke, thank you. It's a very nice way to wrap up. I'm sorry we couldn't take in all the questions. I mean, just to sum up briefly, I think there was a difference of view on the panel about the importance of communication. But there was no difference about understanding what you're trying to do. And whether you're thinking about people as individuals or not, politicians are thinking about solving problems. How are we going to make the NHS better? How do we improve state schools? What might you do about the law? The message I heard very clearly coming back from the panel, I'm not sure how much it would apply to law, and certainly it would apply more to health and education as it's done in the past, is if you give people more autonomy and more control and more independence and more, your final word, responsibility, then they will like it and seize the opportunity. And they might even, at the end of that, start voting Conservative. Who knows? But you need to deliver the policy first. Anyway, thank you all very much. And I'd be grateful if we could all thank the panel.